Hello, welcome to True Hoop with me, Jarod Hector, and today is a special episode. I have with me the author, uh, Built from the Fire. For those of you looking at it on video, you can see the cover. The epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street, 100 years in the neighborhood that refused to be erased. I have the author, Victor Luckerson, with me today. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Jarod. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for being here. So my first introduction to you was a piece you did in 2018 for the Ringer called Black Wall Street, the African American haven that burned and then rose from the ashes. Um, and so you go from that to writing this book. And, I would imagine many people have heard of the Tulsa race massacres by now. One of the more violent acts of racial violence in this country's history happened on May 31st since the early hours of June 1st, 1921. They killed 300 plus people, wiped out businesses and homes and everything. What led you to decide to write this particular book?
Yeah, definitely is a winding journey. Thanks for shouting out the Ringer. I don't know how many folks who read me now know I used to be a technology reporter for the Ringer.com.
What a great website.
Uh, yeah, exactly. The
Yeah.
tagline. Yeah. So, yeah, it was just I mean, for me at least, like I said, I actually have a background in tech and business reporting, but I've always had a passion for writing about Black history and writing about our people. And so when I was at the Ringer, I was kind of in this weird, like, dual role where like technically I was like a tech blogger,
Hmm.
but occasionally I'd be like, hey, I really want to write something about like national affairs or politics or kind of like engage with some other aspect of my interests. And the Ringer was really good, I think, about letting their writers roam a lot. And so I actually remember this kind of getting in the weeds, but I feel like you're a big Ringer guy, so I'll dive in a little bit. And I actually remember I pitched this story to them about Black Wall Street.
Hmm.
Um, and my editor, Sean Fennessy, was kind of like, we don't really have a hook for this. There's not like a date or an anniversary that's really big, but
Right.
it sounds interesting. Why don't you just go?
Hmm.
And so I'm really glad I got that opportunity through them. And for me, kind of the original motivation for it, honestly, was I was living in Atlanta, 2017, 2018, and I was having lunch with one of my friends, my high school friends, that fall, 2017, and the movie 12 Years a Slave came up.
Hmm.
And that's one of those films, Oscar winning,
Hmm.
great film, a film you're kind of like supposed to see, it's a
Yeah, for
capital I
sure.
important
Yeah.
movie,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? And my friend had never seen it. He was kind of almost like a little embarrassed that I haven't seen it, but he basically was like, I'm tired of only seeing us being brutalized in pop culture. Like I don't want to see black folks getting abused as slaves or getting sick by a dog in the civil rights movement. I'm just kind of over it.
Hmm.
And so I asked my friend, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street? That's an example of us being successful.
Hmm.
And so my friend had never heard of Black Wall Street at all. And as you said, it's pretty ubiquitous now. But
Hmm.
if you Googled Greenwood or Black Wall Street in 2017, there really wasn't that much on the internet
Right.
about it.
Hmm.
And so that was really my motivation. That story does say the neighbor that rose from the ashes, that original Ringer piece I
Hmm.
wrote. So I really wanted to capture the full history of the neighborhood in that original piece. And then I sort of carried that mentality over to the book that I wrote. So the book itself captures those 2 days of the race massacre, but it also captures the entire 118 years of Greenwood history.
Hmm.
And I think less people understand that black folks are more than just their trauma. For sure, that was definitely one of my goals with the book.
No, for sure. And I think it clearly comes through in the book when you read it. And it led me to think of something else. When I started reading your book, I couldn't help but think of Isabel Wilkerson's masterpiece, The Warmth of Other Suns. And so I.
That is the highest praise you can give me. So thank you. That was my North Star. Thank you, Jarod. You got to get on Amazon or Goodreads with that one. I need that. I need that hype.
Well, clearly, so it's a book that I'm sure you are very very familiar with. Obviously, having read it, and you said it was your North Star. So, how did it influence you as a journalist and writer?
Yeah, I actually read that book. It was actually recommended to me by a friend when I first was like 20, that same window, 2017, 2018. I said, oh, I'm going to write this book about Greenwood in this neighborhood over a long period of time. And one of my friends recommended that book to me. And it was just mind blowing to me. A few things that book did I think were great. A, being able to meld narrative storytelling with academic rigor. It does that so amazingly well. Like she did so much,
Hmm.
not only academic research, but so much to capture the true lives of those people's stories, the
Hmm.
three main figures in that book who experienced the Great Migration. And then also I thought that book did a really cool thing where it like took an American mythology that everyone's familiar with, which is like the immigrant story,
Hmm.
the Ellis Island immigrant
Hmm.
tale, and sort of applied it to Black people.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I really like that it took this sort of this thing that's part of the American DNA and said, hey, Black people are part of this story too.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think on the one side, I really wanted to make sure that I could do both a lot of academic rigor and research, but also make the book feel like a story. And then also I wanted to sort of place Black people in a place we're not usually allowed to be, which is like the West.
Mm-hmm.
The West is a really big thing in the American mythology. It's a
Yep.
place of new experiences, opportunity, all these kind of things. And that's why, the main family in my book, the good ones, they went West seeking the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
seeking opportunity, seeking a better life. And so I really like the idea of putting us in that American mythos in a way we often aren't allowed to be. And so I think Warmth of Other Suns did that probably better than any other book. And so anytime anybody gives me a little bit of Warmth of Other Suns hype, I'm like, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Well, listen, that's what we're here for, man. No, but that's a few years ago on this here podcast, this was right around the time of the George Floyd shooting and everything. I had, said, during times like this, I was asked, what are you doing? I'm like, honestly, I was like, I go back to books and like there's some comfort and sort of reassurance that I get there. And Warmth of Other Suns was for sure one of the ones I had on that list. And it's interesting because I talk about on that episode how I go back to W.B. Du Bois and different folks like that, and they play a prominent role in your book in the way that the residents of the Greenwood district of Tulsa sort of saw themselves. Right? Was it the W.E.B. Du Bois talented 10th? Was it the Booker T. Washington mold? Like, right, these different sort of positions. And I think what your book does capture very well, and I'd love you to speak to it, is, and I say this all the time when I talk to people, I'm like, you do know Black people are not a monolith, right? Like, it's
Yeah, yeah.
like no other group of people do I feel like, oh, well, you're Black, so you must X. It's like, what? Why? Like what, based on what? Right? And I think you capture that very well in your book, particularly when you talk about the Greenwood district. So let's get into a little bit about the differences within the people inside of Greenwood.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you asked about that, Jarod, because that really is something that was a major goal for me. I'm glad it carried through in the pages. I feel like honestly, when I started the story, I wouldn't necessarily say that was my goal. Like, I was very caught up in the Black Wall Street mythology. I mentioned that I began this project because my friend had never heard of Black Wall Street, and I wanted to give him almost this like blueprint of Black success. That was
Mm-hmm.
kind of the original vision of the book. And then I started actually digging into the archives and reading what these folks thought in Greenwood and in Oklahoma. I kind of realized, like, oh, everybody didn't think alike about, what is the best path forward for this neighborhood and for this community and for Black people as a whole in the United States. And so I think that it became really important to me to present the neighborhood in an authentic way, more so than sort of in like a wish fulfillment
Mm-hmm.
kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so I think that comes across in a few ways. First of all, philosophically, I do set up early in the book this sort of divide between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, sort of the two leading Black intellectuals and leaders of the early 1900s, and sort of this notion that on the Booker T. Washington side, there was this idea, he had this premise that Black folks should essentially perform well in their current works, whether it's like agriculture or in some cases business, and sort of like prove their worth in some sense to the overall American economy. And if we can do that, then because we're valuable, we'll sort of be accepted into the overall white system. That's kind of like his whole premise, basically. Whereas on W.B. Du Bois's side, there was a sense that this system we already deserve our rights based on the Constitution and the way the country is supposed to be organized. So if this country can live up to its ideals, Black people deserve or owed their rights. You know what I mean? And I thought that the sort of interplay between them was really interesting. I really wanted to highlight that. So there's a chapter in the book about when Booker T. Washington came to Oklahoma and was sort of amazed by the entrepreneurship and all this kind of stuff. But then Du Bois is kind of in the background being like, okay, entrepreneurship is cool, but like let's not get too big of a head. We're trying to do something besides just have a few rich Black folks. We want to be able to have a system where all of our people can benefit. And so I think that tension involving Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurship is really important to understand. And I think we see that today when
Mm-hmm.
some people sort of criticize, for example, quote unquote woke capitalism, like, oh, we're gonna like say the right things post
Right.
George Floyd, but what are we doing to actually change the
Right.
society for our people? I think sort of a similar debate simmering in early Greenwood. And one of the things I really love, one of my favorite small details I discovered is, okay, so you have this big national debate between Washington and Du Bois, and they're like these two icons of the era. And then in little old Greenwood, they opened their first high school in the 1910s, and they had to decide what to name it. And there was this big debate: should it be Booker T. Washington High School or should it be Du Bois High School? And for me, that really threw me for a loop thinking about it, because so in my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, we have a Booker T. Washington High School. Lots of people, lots of places do. So does Tulsa. Tulsa chose Washington.
Yep.
It's Booker T. Washington High School. But I know as a kid, I just took Booker T. Washington to be like kind of like correct, just because like his name was everywhere, you know.
Exactly.
It took a lot longer for me to realize who Du Bois even was or what his philosophy was, because his name wasn't anywhere in my worldview. And so that simple decision to name these schools Booker T. Washington High School instead of Du Bois High School probably, made millions of people less aware of Du Bois' philosophy for a long time. So that's a really small decision, it seems like, but it's actually very powerful in the way that we all understand our country and our world. And so I really wanted to get that dichotomy in there. And then the other thing I really wanted to convey about Greenwood was that everybody wasn't rich. That was really important for me to dive into. So early in the book, I sort of explained that there was a lot of poverty in Greenwood. They had challenges with the crime like any neighborhood would have, bootlegging, gambling,
illegal
all
activity,
these things.
Sure, yes.
Yeah. It's all part of the mix. You know what I mean? And so that, again, was to me important, because I think when you see the world that way, it's easier for the reader to place themselves in it, because that's the world we all live in. You know what I mean? Versus some kind of like utopia, fever dream type situation that isn't real. I don't think that's as engaging or immersive or authentic. So that was kind of my goal in terms of going beyond the black monolith, for sure.
I love all of that. It's so funny because when I got into the part where you're making the distinction between Booker T and W. Du Bois, it took me back to college as an undergrad, and I remember because my senior seminar involved. I mean, well, a lot of my college work, I was an English major, but a lot of it revolved around Du Bois and a lot of his work. And I remember, like in one of my classes, you get debated, and you're like in your late teens, early 20s, and I'm like, man, I don't want to hear about Booker T anymore. I'm like yelling at someone across the room. We not here for that sellout. Let's talk about my guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And I'm like out here pushing the talented 10th and all this stuff. And it's so crazy. But and you see, yeah, that was the mindset of like people in it. Like this is me way post. These dudes have been dead for however long by now. But in the moment, right, it's the same type of feeling, like which is the way to go. And to your point, it's not by accident that Booker T. Washington is the name of so many more things that exists today, and W.E. Du Bois is not, right? And it's just, to me, all of that is so fascinating. The one thing we didn't do, and that's my fault, or miss, can you just give people a quick synopsis on what Black Wall Street is? Even for people, by now you should know, but for people who may not, like, what, Black Wall Street, what are you talking about?
Sure, yeah. So Black Wall Street is a nickname for the Greenwood district, which is a black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was a very thriving, entrepreneurial, successful neighborhood in the early 1900s, really throughout the 1900s. And kind of, I think one reason it sort of got this mystique is because I at least didn't know black people were in Oklahoma until I learned about this. I never thought about black people being there, and I'm like, oh, y'all were in Oklahoma and y'all were killing it? That's like two surprises at one time. You know what I mean? So I think that's part of and then also, like I said at the start of this, we don't really get that many success stories as Black people in Black history. And so this idea of this like successful, thriving Black community is just really appealing. But the reason that it's, I guess, been discussed a lot more the last few years is because in 1921, a white mob burned down most of the neighborhood, killing the airport up to 300 people. The incident was instigated by a false rape accusation. A black man was falsely accused of attempting to rape a white woman. But sort of bigger than that, there were these issues about like land use and the fact that the Greenwood area was very close to downtown. So a lot of white industrialists wanted the land. There's the issue of politics. Oklahoma basically imported Jim Crow politics from the Deep South and became a very racist, white supremacist place over time, even though it did not have to be that way. And there's also the issue of Black self-defense. Black folks, when this guy was falsely accused of rape, Black folks, this guy was arrested, Dick Rowland, and black veterans armed themselves and went down to protect him at the courthouse. And white folks did not like that.
Sure enough.
And so, the book kind of explores all these other factors that are going on. I think often when we think about that era, sometimes racial violence can kind of be distilled into like, oh, this a false rape accusation causes all this kind of stuff to happen.
Right.
But there's a lot of other factors that feed into these issues that I try to highlight in the book too.
And,
So.
you do an excellent job. And so I want to go there. Violence, right? And I mean, it's as American as apple pie, right? To not be glib about it. It's the means through which the country was founded, created, maintained, and kept away from others, right? I mean, so how did you see the relationship between the inherent violence of the time, both internally and externally, in the telling of this story?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think one thing that really struck me was how condoned vigilantes were in that era.
Mm-hmm.
Just vigilantism was just sort of part of how justice worked in early 20th century America, and especially in Oklahoma. And so, for example, in the 1910s, these vigilante groups, some of which included real estate men, oil men, very powerful men in Tulsa, they would go around like tar and feathering socialists because they didn't like them. Or criminal people accused of crimes because they thought that they were sort of besmirching the honor of their community. And the police would sometimes actually be involved in even condoning the violence or praising it.
Right.
The media sometimes praised lynchings in Oklahoma. A black woman named Marie Scott lived in this town called Wagoner, which is an hour from Tulsa. She had been arrested on a murder accusation, which probably wasn't true. She was taken from her jail cell and lynched by a white mob in about 1917 or so. And the Wagoner newspaper said, sometimes a lynching is like a good thing. They were literally rationalizing the paper on the opinion page the next week. And so this sort of violence was seen as sort of part and parcel for how to have a functioning society in a lot of ways, especially by white people. I should say that black leaders were actually more likely to be against violence in all its forms, A.J. Smitherman was actually the owner of the Tulsa Star, the black newspaper in Greenwood. And he basically said that there is no place for mob violence, whether it's against a black person, a white person. This is just not how our justice system is supposed to work. I think black people recognize that this sort of lawless world was always going to come back on them harder.
Correct.
You know what I mean? And so they saw that upholding the system that's purported to be what our country is was really their only means of survival. And so it definitely was striking to sort of see. I think there can be kind of like a Wild West image in people's heads of lawlessness, but it's more like the law condoned what these vigilantes were doing. These vigilantes were part of the law.
Yeah.
And that's a very different sort of framework than like a sort of Western movie kind of vibe. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, where you see it today in sort of modern culture is, if anyone who's listening is familiar with the Taylor Sheridan universe, if you watch any of those shows, 1883, 1923, right? All that violence, it is, as Victor's talking about, the marshals and sheriffs are like, all right, okay, you're going to go protect your, oh, cool. I mean, there's not a whole lot they can do. It isn't this idea of someone commits a crime and it's like, okay, let's take them to court. No, none of that. Crime, cool, you're in jail, we're holding you. And then to Victor's point, tension simmer and people are like, no, we need justice demand now. And it often is, right, these mobs of often white people who just, to your point, drag that woman out of her cell, lynched her. It is, and it is, again, it's just baked into the fabric of the country, right? That is how think about it, right? How did the country acquire the land in the first place? Go all the way back. Well, it had to steal it from people, right? How do you take things from people? The threat or actual violence. You can't just, right? That's how things work. Think about today. If you got mugged or robbed, how does that happen? Someone either commits violence or threatens violence against you, right? It is, and it's wild. And that particular, moment in history in 1921, and in your book, you do a great job of talking about, just again through the story of the Goodwin family. Ed was hiding in his bathtub, in his house, and this idea of people literally storming into your neighborhood, and it was a coordinated effort, right, Victor? We had airplanes coming over, dropping, not actual war bombs, but bombs nonetheless, right? Made up bombs. People with kerosene lighting, just coming in and literally just lighting and destroying things. And it's like, wait, what? Like, how was that possible? And this, we're not talking about the 1700s. This was 1921, not that 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah. I think certainly the coordination was something that I really wanted to emphasize. Again, even I think that term, like, there's certain terminology that's been associated with the incident for a long time that implies spontaneity. Mob, that implies that people kind of banded together really fast and did something.
Right.
That they weren't necessarily planning. So the event used to be called a riot for a very long time, and again, riot implies spontaneity, no pre-planning. And so when you actually read sort of what happened and the fact that, okay, these people were able to gather up all these materials to do this wholesale destruction, when you hear firsthand accounts about people saying that sort of in different parts of Tulsa, white Tulsa, that night, there are men standing on the top of cars saying, be ready at 5 a.m. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then also when you just look at the pictures, like, look, you've seen a picture of the neighborhood, Greenwood, afterward, it looks like a bombed out war zone. And there's just no way to execute that level of destruction in the course of like 4 or 5 hours
on a whim. No, that doesn't happen on a whim.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, like I said, my book's very academic and rigorous, and I don't say things I can't prove. And so one of the challenges is, how do you sort of prove how it was planned? And the truth is, we don't exactly know. And so in the book, I don't sort of say in this smoky room 2 weeks before the blueprints were laid out. We don't know if that happened or not. But what I do say is that white Tulsa, had a predisposition for wanting that land. There were these white industrialists who really, really wanted the Greenwood property turn into a train station or a depot or just something else to benefit white Tulsa, basically. That's a fact. We also know that white Tulsa condoned vigilantism and had a lot of paranoia about both like a quote unquote Negro invasion, but also like a communist invasion. Thinking about this is the era of the Red Scare, actually. And so, for example, in white Tulsa, they were, before the race massacre, they were doing aerial exercises with airplanes. The police were, so that if a communist invaded, they would have these planes, they could use them to surveil or attack the commies, basically. There's also experiments in Tulsa or tests to drop nitroglycerin from airplanes, or to show that you could carry nitroglycerin without having the plane blow up. And so in the book, I kind of lay out, there's a lot of capacity, basically. There's a lot of capacity in white Tulsa and powerful Tulsa, too, if they want to execute a plan pretty fast to destroy their enemies, And on the night of the race massacre, Black people became the white enemy very, very fast. And so in the book, I sort of try to tell this line where I'm not going to sort of say, here's a conspiracy, because we can't prove it. But I will bring you every shred of evidence I've found that will sort of let us understand how this conspiracy could have been carried out.
No, yeah, and you do a masterful job of that. And I mean, all the things you said about the Red Scare and how they were like, well, let's plan and prepare for this. I mean, it was the same things they used to actually, to tear down Greenwood. So again, I always say to lawyer friends of mine, I go, circumstantial evidence puts people in jail like very quickly for murder and things of that nature. I'm like, you add 2 and 2 together here, and it's very easy to see how you get to 4, right? Like, this is not rocket science. You don't need to draw a through line. And look, the thing that we've talked around but clearly is evident is what the sign and the visual of Black progress and success, what that meant. Now, again, to your point, you talk about things you can't prove, right? Like, I cannot get into the hearts and minds of people at that time because most of them are dead, right? So I don't know. But we do know historically, right? Because the Greenwood area, this isn't the only place in America that this happened to, right? Prior to the 1921 massacre, we had the Red Summer, right, in 1919. So in many ways, this was kind of predictable what was going to happen, right, to Delta. There is something about Black success and progress that creates animus in white groups during this time.
Yeah. Again, another really small detail that I have in the book that I thought was a great discovery was, so this is the 1910s, a few years before the race massacre. Since we're ostensibly on a sports podcast now, this should be relevant. So baseball was really popular at the time, and Greenwood had a baseball team. There was a Black baseball team in Greenwood in the 1910s, and they started playing these interracial games against white teams. And so the Tulsa Tribune actually said, so the Greenwood team would dominate. They were just dominating. Greenwood team was just winning every single time. And so the white newspaper said, "Hey, we need to cut out these interracial games. Like, we're not feeling this." And they even called it evil. They used the word evil to describe black people and white people playing baseball together.
It's a game.
And so that's
A
kind
kid's
of like
game.
yeah, exactly. So that's kind of like a flippant example, but it shows the depth to which white people resented black success and black progress, I think.
Yeah, without question. No, it was something. Well, the other thing that the book does well, Victor, is you sort of grapple with this idea of linear versus cyclical. And on the one hand, time has passed. It's 2023. You know, as a society, things look different now than it did in the 1910s and 1920s. That's just a factual statement. But in many ways, right? So that's a linear. But in many ways, uh, it's kind of cyclical, right? This idea of violence to take away land has now turned into urban policies and planning and gentrification and different. It's all the same thing ultimately, right? How do I keep certain people from doing what they want to do, right? And it just looks different. So how did you see that as you were doing the academic rigor portion of this, right? This idea between linear progress and cyclical. Everyone's heard the term, right? Progression isn't linear. I'm like, it's true,
Mm-hmm.
it's not. But cyclical isn't progression, right? We're just dancing around the same thing. It may look, the point of view may look different because we're at the top of the circle versus the bottom, but we're still
Mm-hmm.
around that same place and we haven't advanced and gone anywhere.
Yeah, I think really that's almost been a lifelong journey for me, sort of changing my mindset on that. I feel like when I was a teenager, I mean, part of this is probably just being a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
but I definitely was like a cynical. I guess you would have called me an Afro pessimist then. I wouldn't know that term then, but I was probably an Afro pessimist as a high school student. And then when I was a senior in high school, Barack Obama got nominated for the Democratic Party and they became president when I was a freshman in college. And I was like, oh, wow, maybe I've like misjudged sort of what this country is. And maybe we are on some kind of like linear track. And I
And
remember kind of having
now.
that thought. Yeah. So then, that notion was very quickly disrupted. And so I think as that notion was being disrupted in my head because of all the events that unfolded during the Trump era, I guess you would say, I was also learning in my research that, like it's always been cyclical, The Greenwood story itself shows, and the Red Summer shows that black people had made all this progress in the 1910s and no one ever taught us about in school. And then it was literally destroyed,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that was already a huge setback we had faced that disrupts the idea of American progress. I just never heard about it because no one taught me about it in school. And so I think between seeing us in this sort of reset right now that we're going through, and then realizing, that it literally been a reset instigated by white violence and white racism in the 1910s and 20s, I sort of really came to understand that this is a cyclical dynamic, and to me, that puts a lot more urgency on history,
Mm-hmm.
because if our country's story is cyclical in some ways, then we're going to be in these same scenarios that the Greenwood folks were in or other folks were in. And so it's really important to understand how those dynamics occurred. And for me, at least on my side of it, it's not really about the don't let history repeat itself, because I don't think I'm going to convince the kinds of people who are in that white mob to not do their thing again, to be
Right,
honest, whatever
right.
formula it's going to take. But I can learn lessons from the black folks in Greenwood about how they came together
Mm-hmm.
or how they strategized. So to me, that's what's worth learning from. And that's why my book is very hyper focused on the black experience and the Greenwood experience, as opposed to sort of having diverged into what were the white quote unquote villains up to. I don't
Right,
really care that much. They
right.
seem more like the obstacles, the
Mm-hmm.
scenery, the thing that's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be there.
Right.
But I'm like, what are the strategies I can get from these black folks and what they were doing? Because that's what I need to know to move on with my life and with my people. So
Yeah, no, and I think that's a perfect way to describe it. Because I'm sitting here reading, I'm thinking, what the Goodwins were going through in 1914 is the same thing the Goodwin family's doing now in 2023, right? It's just the
mm-hmm.
descendants. It's not much different, right?
Yeah,
It's just doctored up and look and sort of a different lipstick on the pig, so to speak.
right.
So where do things stand now with the Goodwins and Tulsa, specifically Greenwood, as a community?
Yeah. So to your point about parallels, um, so in the early part of the book, before the race massacre, I talk a lot about Tulsa and Oklahoma politics
Mm-hmm,
and sort of these efforts by black folks to go appeal to the mayor for get rid of to eliminate Jim Crow,
mm-hmm,
and to appeal to even the president to eliminate Jim Crow in Oklahoma, and all these things just get shot down again and again and again. Fast forward to now, and I actually spent a lot of time shadowing Regina Goodwin. So Regina Goodwin is the great granddaughter of the couple J.H. and Carly who came to Tulsa from Jim Crow, Mississippi in 1914. And the book kind of follows their family arc over 100 years. So Regina is now a state legislator in Oklahoma. She's one of only 2 Black women in this House of Representatives. So I shadowed her a lot, and I saw that, oh, she's almost having the exact same experience going into these overwhelmingly white spaces of power, sort of speaking things that would provide some level of justice or recompense or peace to her people here in Greenwood, and being shot down every time almost, you know. And I sort of show how she's able to navigate that and sort of eke out a few victories, but it's really, really hard. And, you know, that was really important to me to highlight, because I think it shows, to your point, how so much of the power dynamic has not changed, you know. And even how, this is sort of a side tangent, but even how in some ways Black folks lost a certain amount of power dynamic after integration, you know. You know, Black folks had an economic base because we were segregated and had to provide for each other. We also had a political base because we were all in one spot, and so there would be these sort of like quasi political leaders, like Regina's grandfather Ed, the quasi political leader of Greenwood. He had all this influence because he sort of like had a lot of power and control over the Black community in his own way.
The newspaper, all those things.
Exactly. We don't have anything, those. We don't have those institutions anymore. So we've both lost an economic base, and we've lost a political base. And so it's much easier to excel, I think, individually now as a Black person, but collectively, and the stats show this, that, you know, the wealth gap has increased and all these kind of things. And so, you know, where places the good ones in Greenwood today, I think, is in some ways, I think the beginning of trying to rebuild those institutions, you know. So I think that's, I don't want to continue being Afro-pessimist. I don't like being a pessimist. So I'm trying to focus on what we can do to move forward. And I think my book is actually not pessimistic at all.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And so I think that there's been a lot of movement in Greenwood towards building up new institutions. So, for example, there was a man killed by an unarmed Black man killed by a police officer. The man's name was Terrence Crutcher in 2016, and the book kind of follows sort of Greenwood's experience with the Black Lives Matter movement through this man and his sister Tiffany, who has become a huge police reform activist. And so, for example, Tiffany has like a new nonprofit in Greenwood called Terrence Crutcher Foundation, and they're actually about to buy a huge property in the neighborhood. And like they've like made a lot of positive moves to not only sort of remember Terrence's life, but actually do political action in the community. That's really positive. You know what I mean? And then with Regina Goodwin, what she's doing, she's actually been able to get a federal grant to study removing the interstate from Greenwood. So Greenwood, like so many other neighborhoods, had an interstate bisected in the 1960s. It destroyed a lot of homes and businesses. The neighborhood was never the same. And the federal government has actually awarded $1 billion to remove these interstates from Black communities across the country. And so Regina was able to get a grant for that to actually be considered in Greenwood. And that was something that seemed like a complete long shot.
Right.
Even 2 years ago, she was talking about this, and I was like, that's cute. That's not going to happen.
Right.
You know, but you know, she's got the money. So she got the grant. The federal government is tentatively on board with the concept. We're going to see where it goes.
Yeah.
And so I think those are really positive, transformative things for this community. And I think it's really important. And the book ends, I think, on all these sort of new notes of hope or progress, because at the end of the day, I actually don't think the pessimistic view is it's not that productive, because who wants to live their life like that?
Right.
But also, it's not the way the Green folks thought in the past. Their whole neighborhood was burned to the ground. They rebuilt it within a year.
Correct.
So you cannot be a pessimist and, you know, have that kind of gumption.
No,
for sure.
That's perfect. I'm sure you are. Are you familiar with the collection of essays edited by Kimberly Crenshaw and Kendall Thomas, Critical Race Theory?
A little bit. I haven't actually read through them, but I'm familiar with the concepts.
You're familiar with the concepts, right? So, for those of you that don't know, Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gotanda, Gary Pellor, Kendall Thomas edited a collection of works called Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings that Formed the Movement. And your book loosely falls under something that someone would call critical race theory. You know, the right's been attacking that term forever, or at least more recently. And I don't want to get into why it's silly, but like it just is, right? Like it's on so many levels, right? The actual study of critical race theory is an interdisciplinary thing that is taught at graduate schools and like advanced level college courses, and in like that's right. It's not taught in elementary school, but be that as it may, your book is something that might fall into that category. So congratulations in many ways, right? Of you being of one of those people who has a book that people might want to consider not letting people read. But you kind of touched on it. But what is your hope for people when they finish reading your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies. One of the most rewarding or valuable responses I've gotten so far was one of my events here in Tulsa. There was a guy, like about our age, I guess, who was from North Tulsa. He was like, "Oh, I read your book, and I learned things about my neighborhood I didn't know. I understand my neighborhood a little bit better now." And that was really powerful to me to have somebody who's from the community saying like, "Oh, I sort of put some pieces together about how and why this place is the way it is." So I think for me, that's like by far the greatest thing. If I've been able to, because all I really did was collect a lot of different puzzle pieces. You know what I mean? Everything in my book is from someone else, whether it's so many of the Greenwood residents and descendants, or from the census records or whatever it is. These are all little scraps of information about Greenwood that I was able to assemble into this project. And so if I've been able to help someone from here sort of see their neighborhood in a fuller way, I think that's really powerful. I know that when I had my event here, it was at the Greenwood Cultural Center, which is basically like the historic community center in the neighborhood. And that was actually one of my first public events like that. And I was really nervous. I didn't know if I'd even be good at this. And it was kind of crazy because like I was like explaining redlining and then the crowd like cheered. It's like a rally, but like an academic rally. And that was just kind of surprising to me. But I get it because if I explain redlining in a digestible way, it makes it easier to understand why there's disinvestment in North Tulsa today. It all stems from that. Right. You know what I mean? And so I think people really responded to the idea that here's a work that explains all the reasons this place is the way it is, and it sort of disproves the idea that you can drive through that neighborhood and be, oh, it must be because the people here. It must be because they don't take care of themselves, they can't or whatever. Or they're somehow lesser.
Right.
I think the book is a rejoinder to that knee-jerk reaction that some white folks in Tulsa honestly have. I know when I first was visiting here, I would visit a lot in the first couple of years of my research. I took a lot of Ubers and whatnot. Oh yeah, I'm thinking about moving to Tulsa. Oh, don't go to North Tulsa. I got that a lot from just taxi drivers. You know what I mean? And so I think that a work that can put into context why this place has so much disinvestment, I think is really valuable. And so I think that's on the local side what I want people to get from it. And I think for people outside of Tulsa, I hope that they'll read this book and think about the parallels to their own community. We've already discussed how the Tulsa Race Massacre wasn't unique for the era. So wherever you live, your town or somewhere near your town had racial violence in that era. Wherever you live, your town had a black neighbor that was disrupted by the interstate or urban renewal policies in the mid-20th century. Wherever you live, there's been police violence in the last decade that's disrupted the lives of black folks near you. And so I think this book, because it's basically a community profile, I hope people will think about how their own communities have experienced all of these same things and maybe how they can be more engaged in understanding that history and helping have better outcomes in the future.
No, I think that's perfectly well said and a good place for us to take a break. All right, Victor. So we are a sports podcast, as you mentioned. Now, so in our emails back and forth, we are an NBA podcast, and you said, man, I'm gonna have to go back to like Sega Genesis and pull out like NBA Live to talk about basketball because I don't really, I'm not up on it now. So I think I want to start there. So what kind, if someone asked you what kind of, like as I am, what kind of sports fan are you? What would you say?
Lapsed.
Nice, lapsed. Okay. What are the reasons for that lapse as a sports fan?
So it was definitely like ubiquitous. I have an older brother who's a massive sports fan. He's like a super sports nut, and my dad is like, I was like an average watch a sports center kind of dude. So it was very ubiquitous when I was a kid. And so when I was a kid, it was like osmosis. It was just kind of like, okay, we're watching Sports Center every day. So like I know the entire lineups for the Bulls, obviously, but also the Pacers. Yeah. My dad went to IU for college. So he's had the weird Indiana obsession his whole life. Okay. So we were kind of like a Pacers house.
is what it is.
Yeah. And then I'm also a huge video game fan. Okay. And so that's why among the mix, there would have to be NBA Live, Madden.
Okay.
Coach K's NCAA basketball. I don't know if you remember that one. Okay. So that was all as a kid. I think that as I got older, I really started just gravitating towards Alabama football because I went to the University of
Mm-hmm.
Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And then I feel like, honestly, I was still like kind of watching some sports, but the pandemic threw it off for me, man, because everything became more arbitrary. Like every single league is like, well, this isn't a real season, so why should I watch? And it kind of just like kind of like knocked the bug out of me. So the last thing I was holding on to was I used to play tennis a lot, so Serena Williams majors. That was my thing for a long time.
Yeah.
And now we don't have that anymore either. So.
Okay. So what would it take for you to become invested in sports again? It seems to me a figure, whether it be a Serena Williams type person, but could be tennis, could be basketball, whatever. There has to be some compelling figure, I think, to draw you back in. Is that what I'm
Oh
hearing?
yeah, it's gotta be a good narrative. I was all about the narratives, the Tiger narrative, the Williams sisters narratives. Even like going back to the Pacers, I love the 30 for 30 about Reggie Miller.
Yeah, winning time.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. Just like the troll, the troll of the '90s NBA. I love the persona, like you said. So even though I don't watch that many sports now, I do love sports documentaries because I love the drama that sports can create. So sometimes just the distilled documentary versions all I need instead of actually watching all the sports.
So is it a lot of it? I imagine is a product of. So you grew up in Alabama, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
So not having a pro team, that probably was part of it down there, right? You don't have a pro team. I mean, yes, University of Alabama football, Roll Tide is a thing, but you don't have an NBA team, you don't have a pro baseball team, right? You don't have an NFL team. So that probably made it a little bit challenging too.
Yeah. If you're from Alabama, you just default to Atlanta sports. So was a massive Michael Vick fan. I specifically remember I was like, Vic, first of all, Vic and Vic, this is amazing when he came out. And then I desperately wanted a Michael Vick jersey as a kid. I wanted one so bad. They were like $200 or $300. They were so expensive. And then finally, I'm like 13 or 14 or something, and my parents get me that Michael Vick jersey. Like, nice. I'm waiting literal years for this. Literal years. Fast forward a couple months, Michael Vick is arrested. I'm like, oh, this is the biggest pariah in sports, and I cannot wear. I'll be getting
You're fine.
I'll be getting PETA throwing like paint on me for wearing his jacket out. I mean his jersey out. So we were a Atlanta default city and family, I guess.
Okay.
Without having any Alabama professional sports.
No, that makes sense. It's interesting though because we had just done a series here on the future of the NBA and sort of what's happening to it and how it's evolving. And for you, it's about the narratives and the compelling drama. So, as someone that's what it takes for you, have you found a change in just the way that sports stories are told? I mean, we know the media industry as a whole is going through this not great change. AIs are taking people's jobs, right? So, but the narrative storytelling, right, of sports, I feel like that's gone away a bit. Is that yeah? So has the way that sports narrative changed? Has that or the telling of sports stories changed? Has that affected you as a fan?
I mean, I guess so. I mean, for example, I think about how the NBA is much more perimeter based now, and like the players are kind of more like multi-purpose, but it also makes them less sort of puzzle chess pieces on the board. You know what I mean? Because they can all kind of do the same thing. So you don't have like the Shaq figure and the Kobe figure, and they're doing totally different things on the court, and they have these different personalities, and it all kind of fits together in this very cohesive way in my mind for a narrative. Whereas now it seems like everybody's sort of supposed to be a jack of all trades in some sense. And so in that sense, they kind of like everybody seems more interchangeable in my head as somebody who just very casually watches. And he worked for the Ringer for several years, so I do know the basics of how the NBA is evolved. again, osmosis.
I was gonna say that's a definite. Can't work there without having some NBA knowledge. Victor, this has been a pleasure. Everybody, Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street, 100 years in the neighborhood that refused to be erased. Victor Luckerson, it was a pleasure. Everybody go out, check that out. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Jarod. This is a great convo.
No problem.